Hello and welcome to the Game Art Remastered panel featuring Brian Sousa from Blizzard Entertainment talking about StarCraft Remastered. Cory from Vicarious Visions will be talking about Crash Bandicoot, and Yujin will be talking, from Shiny Shoe, will be talking about Full Throttle. I'm going to start this one off with StarCraft Remastered. There's a lot of questions people have about why we would remaster a game. For instance, why would you remaster a game? I'll talk a little bit on that and mostly about how we did it. And there we go. This is not working. There we go. So most of you probably don't remember the good old days of the 1990s. Blizzard had just hit two pretty successful games with Warcraft 1 and Warcraft 2. And while we did think about other games that we could develop, another RTS was inevitable. What we did, though, is we switched genres altogether from fantasy to science fiction, and we added a third race. So we have the Stoic Terrans, the enigmatic Protoss, and the swarms of Zerg. A little bit about StarCraft. It was about a 3-year development cycle. We took a little time off for Diablo, if you remember that. And it was released in the spring of 1998. Brood War was released later that year, and this was actually the formation of a dedicated cinematic team. I should know, I was there. I'm on the top row, still bald, still angry. Just kidding. 20 years later, 20 pounds later, and that's me now. Blizzard has released many new games since StarCraft had come out. But the fact is that millions of people are still playing StarCraft 1. Hundreds of tournaments, professional tournaments have been played. The players have recreated and reimagined our editors to create new maps. And they've even set up private servers so they could play games with matchmaking and ladders. This was a picture from Busan when we released the remaster, and around 30,000 people showed up for our the release of StarCraft Remastered. However, we felt that it is actually our duty to keep these games alive, keep them up to date and accessible to all of our players. And so the Blizzard Classic Games team was formed. I came on the team about 2 years ago, and I was focusing mainly on StarCraft Remastered. I had worked on the original, so they felt that my expertise would be invaluable. StarCraft was released at 640 by 480 resolution. It had 256 color palette and an amazing 15 frames per second. But it did have 8-player multiplayer, and that is what helped StarCraft become what it is today. So when we look back at what we were going to do with bringing StarCraft into our current battle platform, I should say, of BattleNet, we talked to the community and the professional players. We said, hey, what would you like to see? Oops. What could we fix? There's bugs in the game still. And what changes could we make? Well, a lot of it we suspected, and a lot of it was surprising. For instance, we knew we shouldn't touch the gameplay. The game has been played for 20 years. Everybody loves the game as it is. It's like chess. You can change the board, you can change the pieces, but don't change the rules or how it plays. Don't fix the bugs. The bugs are incorporated into the gameplay now, and these players require these bugs. They like these bugs, they know, and they work around these bugs, and that's what makes a master player. There was one bug we fixed, however. Early in the development, Mike Morheim came to us, and he mentioned that there was a bug in that he introduced back in 1997, and it was just an animation that played one frame out of order, and it really bugged him. And so we actually said, okay, we'll fix that bug for you. It doesn't have anything to do with gameplay. We're good. And don't change the look. This was kind of surprising to us, but the fact that StarCraft looked a certain way was really key to the players. So this led us to say, well, what can we do with the remaster? And my boss came to us and he basically told us, don't screw it up. because this game has been played for so long, so many people love this game, still playing this game, that anything we do, we can't screw it up, right? Which also gives us a lot to work with. So we started thinking about what our options could be. What if we did this? Well, we want to bring it up to 4K resolution, future-proofing it, so in 20 years we're not revisiting all of these assets again, redoing them. We put in 16:9 widescreen support. Integration into Battle.net was key. That brings you up into today's player base. Seamlessly playable with the standard version, which was a huge undertaking to make that possible. We wanted to put in new lighting, additional ramp directions, additional animation frames, and my personal, because I worked on the cinematics, I really wanted to update them for today. However, not all of these were possible. But we were able to up-res the graphics. Problems were, we had no original assets to work from. We found a CD that one of the artists had burned that had assets from early games, Diablo, StarCraft, Warcraft 2, and I was able to find a few models. They didn't have any textures on them, and they were very rough, to say the least. We didn't have any art tools. All of the tools were gone, so we had to rewrite the art tools. And basically what we did was we extracted all of the original assets and then scaled them up 400% to see what kind of resolution we're working with. And when we did this, we found out there's no consistent cameras or lighting. I don't know what those artists were thinking, but we had to eyeball everything to make sure that the perspective was right for the game and not right for what you would think. So what did we do? We said, let's get our style down. And we worked with the battle cruiser. Battle cruiser is big, it's badass, and it's iconic. Everybody knows the battle cruiser. So this was our first test. We set up a huge style guide about how we did it and what we were going for. And we showed these to our group, our focus group. They hated it. It wasn't what they wanted. They already thought we were screwing up the game. And so we had to rethink. And so we came up with a second battle cruiser, which, as you can see, is more in line with the original. We went back then and we looked at all of the original concepts. Sam Didier was awesome. He kept everything he's ever drawn, ever, in these folders. And so I got a lot of the stuff from him. And you can see the Zergling had little arms on his back. The Ghost actually has 6 fingers, which I really forced into the game somehow, but you'll never see it. So this is what we did. We took the original asset, and then we did a concept of what kind of details we would add to this concept. Where could we go with this? Just kind of enhancing what was already there, just filling in the gaps. And then our final was rendered, and we built off of that final concept so that when you look at the game, you instantly recognize everything in it. Animations. This was one that we really wanted to do. If you look at StarCraft, the animations are very stiff. There's not very many frames for any of the things. Some of them have 4 or 5 frames for a complete cycle, and they're playing this at 15 frames a second. So they're just repeating frames over and over. We did a test with the Zealot of how it could be. We added a new idle frame. We added a new run. It turns out that this was a little bit too much, and it changed the game, the perception of the game, of how these units acted. Some of the professional players actually would recognize frame 3 of the Zergling's attack as when it does the damage, and then it can move it away. So we basically had to scrap our ideas of adding animation. And speaking of the Zergling, originally we had him in and we had a play test, and the professionals felt he felt too small. He was exactly the same size, and it was all perception because we didn't change the hit test box at all. It's the same one from standard, but because they felt it was smaller, they perceived it that way. So we scaled it up a little bit just so they would have a easier time of it. We were also able to go through the angles. Originally the game was supposed to have 32 angles, yeah. But because of memory constraints at the time, it was cut down to only 16, which is only 9 flipped. So frames 1 and 2, exactly the same. 3 and 4, exactly the same. And we went in and we were able to put in more angles of rotation. One of the biggest changes we did was for the lighting. We have the standard in-game sprite, which matches almost one-to-one with the originals. However, we added a new lighting system, which adds ambient occlusion mapping, depth mapping, normal mapping, specular map. And this gives the actual, we have in-game lighting that can affect these to make it a little more depth, like a 2.5D representation. We were actually able to put lights onto units, and so they kind of glowed and they would affect the buildings. And of course, we had to add widescreen support. Now, you would probably think this is not a big deal. Change the camera, you're good. The biggest problem was the consoles, and the consoles were a pain in the butt. We had to make them be expandable from 4x3 to 16x9, and we worked on these consoles up until ship, until after ship, with feedback from the community, because they just weren't feeling right. So finally we got something in. We have these expandable consoles, and I'm happy we never have to do it again. The environments. As many of the units and the buildings as there was 8 environments that we had to do, each with thousands of individual cells. And each of these cells had to be put together like a puzzle piece. And we had no way of knowing how these things worked. We actually had to create documents, and we had the engineers extract all of the numbers so you could see them on screen, like which tile goes to which tile. And there's like, just in the tile sets alone, there's 33,000 of these that we had to make sure that all fit together. And we did add some new water. The original water was color cycled, usually with 5 colors, and it just kind of rotated through them. And then we added a new shader to the water, and I think this was the biggest revamp for the actual graphics. The ramps. There was only 2 ramps in StarCraft, Southwest and Southeast, which at the time seemed it was okay, right? We didn't expect this to be a huge tournament-based game that's been played for 20 years. The community stepped up again, and they actually created in the world editor their own ramps using pieces that were already existing. Well, they were hard to make, and they didn't actually fit in that well. So we took our time and we put in all new directions. So we added 6 directions, and all of these are expandable, so you can make whatever size ramp you want. And we also put these into the standard definition so that you can play still with your friends that didn't get the HD version. Cinematics. This is what made me sad, because I think if anything makes it still feel dated are the cinematics. And of course, there's the people out there that think nostalgia. These cinematics are what makes StarCraft StarCraft. I wanted to do some updated versions, even cutting them down, because we had 30 minutes plus in StarCraft and Brood War of pre-rendered cinematics, and it just wasn't feasible in today's age to recreate these. The only thing we were able to do is the story mode. We had basically text screens that drove the story. And we went through and we added interstitials that added characters that you know from StarCraft 2, Mengsk and Kerrigan, and here's the Fall of Phoenix. And we kind of illustrated these to be a little more interesting for the story. So that's pretty much the gist of what we did for StarCraft. I know that don't screw it up isn't much of a mantra to go off of for remastering a game. But people play this game for a reason, and we didn't want to screw it up. Everything we changed or added is an option. If you don't want the rotation, you can turn that off in the menu. If you don't want the lighting, you can turn that off. If you want to play it in standard definition, you can still do that. You can play it in 4x3. Everything is optional. So no matter if you like it or not, it's up to you, like how much you want to get into it. That's it. We had no original assets or tools. We had self-imposed guidelines of what we could do, but we still successfully updated this game without actually breaking it. StarCraft Remastered was released with much positive feedback, and we enjoyed a resurgence of interest in a game older than many of its new players. Thank you so much. Next is Cory, and he's going to be speaking about Crash Bandicoot. Did I hit something?
Sent it to sleep.
What the heck? Okay, don't look at my password. That's not that.
Cool. All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm Cory from Vicarious Visions, as Brian said. I was one of the character artists on the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy. And I'll be talking about our approach to remastering the Crash's characters, and specifically the way we thought about our work in the context of the state of the franchise and fans' expectations. For those not familiar with these games, the Crash trilogy was created by Naughty Dog for the PlayStation 1, and here's a quick set of clips of our own and the original from our reveal trailer. So this was from our initial reveal. Things like some color tuning were not fully dialed in yet, but what's key to know is that aside from raw geometry reference for our level layouts, our art was being created from scratch and by eye. We didn't have a traditional concept pass for our project, so we leaned on the seniority of our production artists who would need to come together and form consensus on the best approach for building our kind of very large amount of content. I'm a character artist by discipline, and some of my previous work at VV was to help integrate Bowser and Crash into the Skylanders games. Doing this gave me some practical experience trying to meet the goals of a new and different product while being respectful of a brand's heritage. I personally think it's wise to recognize the meaning iconic franchise characters have to their audience and to their fans. My deck will focus on characters, but I hope to reflect the feelings and approach of our remaster project in general. And I feel this kind of work kind of begs you to yourself become a fan, which is a point that I'll be returning to. So what were our broad goals? Our game is a from-scratch rebuild of the original 3 Crash games. A high-level overview of our approaches, we wanted to represent the original games faithfully while building everything from scratch from the get-go. Both out of necessity, we didn't have access to everything, and a desire to achieve a modern presentation. In the end, we'd hope to kind of freshly reignite the love fans felt for the original by giving them something consistent with their memories, but also that felt visually modern. For characters, we wanted to bridge the gap between the classic 32-bit look of the original game and somewhat of a feature animation type style, blend the low poly punch of like Naughty Dog's original art with modern expectations to find a kind of sweet spot of maximum nostalgia. Both of these things so as to hopefully not disappoint anyone playing it totally fresh or for the first time in 2 decades. And this could mean the usual things like more rounded out volumes, smoother deformations, more detailed texture presentation. But importantly, we couldn't sacrifice the essential design language that would be key to triggering those kind of fond feelings we wanted our audience to experience. Now there's 2 particular challenges that we dealt with that I'd like to kind of focus on. Finding faithful designs for the rebuilt characters and supporting faithfully dynamic performances for them. Because we were rebuilding these games from scratch, part of the question becomes, where do we pull our style and inspiration from? This can become a dilemma. It could be easy to go down the path into a full remake or reimagining territory, where changes that are not carefully executed could lead fans to question the intent of a product, a game like ours. Now, as a personal example, I remember as a kid watching cartoons. I would often wonder why characters would look off-model from like their 16-bit kind of representations if I was watching a video game cartoon. That's a harmless effect of graphical limitations at the time. But the point is like that we would want to try to avoid evoking that kind of disconnect with what we were making, that we wanted people to feel comfortable that what they were looking at is what they remembered and what they cared about. Because we were wanted to flesh out the low poly source art, we needed to consider kind of where we should pull our character design influence from. At first, we kind of flirted with the kind of simple idea of taking inspiration from original concept art, from toys, costumes, later era models, things that were already more kind of fleshed out and detailed in 32-bit games. While this would make sense, seem to make sense while targeting a higher fidelity look, They really kind of diverge to a degree. While the various looks of Crash have commonalities, orange fur, blue shorts, spiky hair, people have particular opinions about which one they might personally want to see. The Crash Band had been relatively dormant, and the art style had changed over the years, and this seemed to kind of cause a sense of confusion to a degree among the fan base. And we had to be mindful of what source we were pulling from. This is a discussion we had to have in regards to every character and all the assets in the game. Crash is just a kind of a clear, good example of the variation that the brand experienced over the years. The conclusion is that we eventually came to is that these higher fidelity assets, marketing materials and stuff, is they lack the simplicity and direct lines of the PlayStation 1 art that most people were likely to be subconsciously responsive to. We tried to keep our ear to the ground and observe how people responded to different game remakes, or how they had discussed our previous Crash efforts. Our solution was to kind of preserve the essential angularity of the 32-bit models, of the vintage look, get the character designs right by being faithful to classic looks the majority of audiences would have nostalgia for, without actually creating low poly art ourselves. When I say essential angularity, I tend to mean the major movements of the shape and silhouette. So, these are what I feel people respond to on a kind of core level. So artists needed to not be selfish, had to let go of our previous styles and any desires to really heavily reinvent these characters. We kind of had to reverse engineer them back to their core, not over-design or fix them. These characters have a lot of appeal in their own way, and we should polish and not try to lose that kind of core essence. For Crash himself, this meant keeping that basic triangular shape language that was essential. Preserve it because it's so easy to lose those kind of strong core primitive shapes when you want to be making art that feels modern and impressive. This is something we strove to keep in mind. Which isn't to say we were completely literal all the time. Calls had to be made like fitting Crash's eyes a little bit better into his cranium, kind of giving him more structural integrity, kind of more flexibility for animation and consistency. You can see this approach here applied on Entropy as well, the old model and the new model, just kind of being mindful of certain shape regions and the relative relationship they have even during pretty noticeable squash and stretch. So kind of moving on from what worked to when there were complications for us. We found eventually that individual perception of the retro graphics could cause disagreement. Definitely among the fan base, and even among artists working on a given task. There's only so much fidelity that was visible to most people playing these games in the first place over composite cables on their CRT TV. Videos an artist might be referencing might have been captured at a low resolution. It can lead to a lack of clarity over what some characters' prop pieces were. As a kid, I remember trying to look through my TV screen, trying to get past the color bleed of the CRT, trying to see the pixels of the characters more clearly. An early unfinished version of this green character right here was shown in one of our trailers early on. We were called out in some comments for not getting the colors right or for it having a slightly odd look. The truth was it was an unfinished asset that had slipped out into the wild like sometimes happens, unfortunately. But we were also called out for not realizing what the character was. Some people saw a lizard character. That was the actual intent. Others saw some kind of moving plant. They were discussing what they remember seeing in the original game. The real truth was more complicated. It was some kind of cyborg lizard with a laser eye, with a molten frill, with bionic parts. A pretty complex set of characteristics to illustrate in such low fidelity. Something that's actually a little hard to deconstruct for even a current artist. It was funny, it was a little silly, but it was an illuminating moment for us. We established that personal interpretation is a potential challenge for anyone remastering games like Crash of that vintage. Luckily there was great rejoicing when this one asset seemed to be adequate at release. I think posts like this are more kind of in jest about the amount of scrutiny that almost every aspect of a game being remastered goes through. But still, the point being, if people care about what you're doing, and if you're remastering something, probably people care about it, you got to understand that you're going to be looked at and scrutinized, and it's an interesting dialogue back and forth. So the other big piece for us on the character side was hitting performance consistency with that kind of zany dynamism that Naughty Dog's original Vertex animations were known for. The level of stretchy, smeary deformation that they had was not something that we had been focused on doing a lot of in our Skylanders work that we were doing before Crash Bandicoot. A few examples of Crash's expressiveness right here. It was important to keep in mind things like his large asymmetrical eyes, his kind of like independently scaling pupils, and squared off jaw that can go from extreme close to ridiculous open. These were all things that we would have to hit. And unlike in Sky, we aimed for less detail in our sculpts, to get clean major forms only, to support this very stretchy, deformable topology. We used the same character models for our cinematics and for our in-game characters, and we didn't build any mascot-like expressions in. We aiming for like a pretty true neutral to support more dynamic performance and a wider range of appealing expressions. It's the kind of thing that feels risky when you're doing it, when you're used to making a stylized game, to not build in any character, but it is a more sensible cinematic workflow and for a greater range of animation. Here's Crash's flat shaded model with a summarily expression test by our rigger, Jim Donnelly. Because Crash was known for such expressiveness, we were anxious to see if everything would come together in a flat shaded view on our target character. This was probably day one, like the first pass topology with the first rig, and it was kind of a really nice relief to see that our kind of assumptions and plans were hopefully going to work, and we were going to find the expressiveness we were looking for. And we still had a lot of time to polish at this point. So to show you a little bit of how we vetted some of our work, here's a gag test by cinematic animator Eric Johnson, seeing if we could hit this kind of classic zany animated feel as well. I'd love to play it for you again, but I don't think it's going to roll. Well, let me try. Oh, okay, move on. The thing being that what we needed was a lot of flexibility, a lot of bendiness. We had to kind of like internalize kind of the classic like kind of sense, like that topology should be even and nicely distributed. We had to like really keep this in mind with the characters we were using because of the amount of stretchiness we wanted, and the amount of influences per vert. Also, it played really well with the fur shader we were using. Having this nice kind of consistent ring mesh type topology allowed the fur shells to kind of stretch uniformly and not look too distorted. To get Crash's eyes to work, his eyeball topology needed to be stitched directly into his eyelids for one contiguous mesh. He still had a bit of a sphere under there, but the lids could open beyond their widest extents and begin to stretch, which is kind of like a mix of an old school kind of painted on eye and a normal eyeball. The pupils then would slide around on the surface in a very cartoony manner and could be scaled independently. Since we weren't completely literal to the original geometry, ideally we'd have an even greater expressive range, getting full wacky and hopefully with the ability to control for more nuance and subtlety on the occasions it was called for. In the end, the player was meant to go, this looks good. That's the reaction we wanted. Our art should not have been overly distracting or to the average player for its stylistic choices in comparison to the original. We didn't want to be overly burdened by hardcore fan reaction. However, it could really be an interesting gauge for us to see if our art choices blended in, or if we were distracting and breaking our "this is how I remember it" goal. We wanted to give a little bit more than a straight remaster report, but we didn't want to go too far and kind of break everyone's immersion. We learned some good lessons from the path we chose. We're very happy with the fan reaction. Hopefully people enjoyed it. We think it was very wise to be aware of how the Crash Bandicoot brand was being perceived at the time we were working on our project, and how it was being scrutinized. And especially important to not be above our source material, to look to embellish and not replace what was there, but to keep clear targets on how to achieve that. I think people love these franchises, enough so that they're out there producing their own art and keeping the torch burning, even when the series is dormant for long stretches of time. I believe it pays to be respectful and to recognize like that love if you're doing this type of work. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. If you'd like to talk about anything covered today, or the merits of playing retro games on CRTs versus upscalers, I'd love to talk about that. Up next is Yujin from Shiny Shoe. Yeah, no worries.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Yujin Kiem, co-founder and art director of Shiny Shoe, an indie studio located here in San Francisco. Shiny Shoe makes original titles and also partners with other studios on their titles. We teamed up with our friends at Double Fine to remaster the classic LucasArts point-and-click adventure games Grim Fandango, Day of the Tentacle, and Full Throttle. Today I'm going to focus on our actual production experience on Full Throttle Remastered, in relation to some assumptions about remastering the visuals of a game, assumptions I myself have made in the past, or heard during planning or budgeting meetings, or heard from consumers. Specifically, 1, remastering is just a reskin. It just needs a fresh coat of paint. 2, we have better tools now. It should be easier to build assets, it will take less effort, and things will go more quickly. 3, we have assets from the original, so we can reuse stuff or leverage existing assets. It's been my experience that these are false assumptions that can put you and the production team in a tight spot. Fortunately, the Full Throttle team was an experienced group, and while we did not make such assumptions outright, we still faced a lot of production challenges that would have proved self-destructive had we made such assumptions. Many resources were invested into reviving Full Throttle, which I hope gives you food for thought for your projects, be it a remaster or even an original title. When Shiny Shoe first partnered with Double Fine to remaster Grim Fandango, Day of the Tentacle, and Full Throttle, a core philosophy that Tim and Double Fine consistently emphasized was to remain true to the original experience. We want to keep true to the original work of art. It's a collaboration of a bunch of artists coming together, the acting, the writing, the sound design, the music, and animation. All these people work together to make this thing, and we don't want to mess with it. We just want to present it in the best possible way and make it more true to the original intentions. We're getting rid of artifacts, compression, and aging technology to make it look like it looks in our minds. A key decision in adhering to this core philosophy was to port the original game engine to current platforms, or to paraphrase our programmer, Trevor Dean, while the game is running for the user, query the game state each frame and retrieve enough data about the game state so we can then provide the user with a more modern presentation. So as far as the game is concerned, it's still ticking along like it had back in 1995. This meant that we had to author the remastered assets in a similar way that the original artist did back in 1995, but of course, with modern tools. No problem. That's just a reskin, a fresh coat of paint. Like painting over 20-year-old paint on a house. Sure, it's easy. Plus, we have modern spray guns and stuff, right? Excuse me. I'm confident that any professional house painter will tell you it's not that simple. Preparation is required before a single can of paint is opened. There's tons of scraping, spackling, sanding, masking. There's a process and a pipeline required to do the job properly so that it holds up over time so that your customer is satisfied. The original Full Throttle paint was beautiful, a blend of 2D and 3D assets and animations. It was unique for its time, but it was of its time, and now it's 22 years old. The game's original resolution was 320 by 200 pixels. The remaster had to support 4K resolution, well over 10 times the original resolution. In other words, that 10 by 10 foot wall that needed a fresh coat of paint is suddenly 100 by 100 feet, 100 times the scraping, spackling, and sanding. But we have better tools now. It should be easier to build assets. Things will go much quicker than it did for the original. It's my understanding that the original Full Throttle development team used D-Paint, proprietary animation and editing tools, and 3D Studio released 2 or 3 for production. I'm not sure how many here are old enough to remember D-Paint or 3D Studio before it was maximized, but just for kicks, they look like this. Limited colors in D-Paint and no character rigging in 3D Studio. And if I recall correctly, UV mapping meant rotating the camera so that it faced the polygon and taking a screenshot or using graph paper. Clearly they were limited tools by today's standard, but powerful at the time and the best available. A nice big paint bucket and durable brush to paint that 10 by 10 foot wall. And paint that wall they did, creating Full Throttle's unique visual style and universe. For the remaster, Photoshop, Flash, Premiere, and Maya were our modern spray guns. But remember that 100 square foot wall is now 10,000 square feet. Aside from the pure physical scale that needed to be reworked, the upres created content issues. Things that could be alluded to or suggested in the original were obviously incomplete or awkwardly amorphous at 4K. Furthermore, the now standard 16:9 aspect ratio created dead space around the original 4:3 aspect ratio. Rather than pillar or letterbox the image, we extended the scenes with new content, which in turn created new issues for visual composition, animations that crossed the screen, or gameplay that relied on the original boundaries of the visual plane. This created new design discussions and feedback loops to devise new guidelines to preserve the original intent of the visuals while adding new content. We're all aware that modern spray guns have shortcomings of their own. Custom pipelines often push tools to perform in ways that they were not designed for. For example, Full Throttle's animation engine, briefly described here by Oliver Franske, put Flash in a bad way. We stuck with Flash because it suited the character art style, animators are familiar with it, and we had existing tools and pipelines from the remaster of Day of the Tentacle. But further into production, the difference in the animation engine from Day of the Tentacle amplified minor pre-existing problems in authoring. Alignment between animation components and animation slots became problematic, and Flash really pooped its pants when high-res, pre-rendered 3D frames needed to be incorporated. Granted, by introducing high-resolution raster images, we pushed Flash in the way that it wasn't meant to be pushed. But we were too far into production to make changes in authoring tools. Instead, more resources had to be put into existing animation pipelines to shore it up. For cutscenes, we went with Premiere, primarily because we were familiar with it, but automating Premiere for cutscene rendering proved to be challenging in the time frame that we had. Thus, since every tweak, bug, or polish pass required a cutscene to be reprocessed through a fairly complex export cycle, we ultimately poured a lot of resources into managing and maintaining that pipeline. So while new tools are more powerful, you're not using them in the same context of the original, which seems to be the root of the misconception. People assume we're making similar assets to the original, but with new, more powerful tools. But new pipelines carry as much overhead as they ever did, and new specifications and expectations keep pace or outpace the tools. So in many ways, you are in the same boat as the original team. We have advantages over a full development cycle because game mechanics, concepts, and designs may remain the same, but a remaster involves a brand new production cycle that is rife with production challenges of its own. But we have assets from the original, so maybe we can reuse stuff or leverage existing assets. There might be an argument for this if the original game is within a generation of current technology. For Full Throttle, however, the 22-year-old game's archives was a cardboard file box of CD-ROMs and binders. The CD-ROMs of the source art contained scans of Peter Chan's original concepts and incremental and redundant copies of individual artists' hard drives from 1995. Within those hard drive backups were file folders of incremental source and intermediate 3D and 2D files. Basically, there was no master source control project that we could use, and there was no tracking documentation that we could find, so we had to sift through all the data and create tracking spreadsheets just to figure out what and where everything was. In terms of 2D assets, aside from the scans of Peter's original concepts, which were really cool, we found no higher res authoring source files. Instead, Oliver extracted frames from the shipped source code to create authoring files in Photoshop and Flash, and artists and animators worked from low-res referenced images scaled up to 4K resolution. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation with that much resolution difference. On the 3D front, we had source files, but since there was no source control, we could not determine which files were actually used to render the game's final assets. Going by latest state was pointless because there was no guarantee that the file was actually used in the final product. Trevor ended up creating a special tool just to isolate the best or closest 3D animation file used in the game. It was a viewing and sorting tool that played thumbnail previews rendered out from each source 3D file, as well as the original intermediate output frames from 2D files, alongside the final footage of the original game. We filtered by file format and frame count ranges and cherry-picked the files that looked correct. It was a fantastic tool, but we still spent weeks distilling the archives down to the files needed for remastering. Check out Trevor's blog on Gamasutra detailing the process and tools involved. After we isolated Full Throttle's source 3D files, custom scripts and tools were created to import the relevant original data, mostly cameras and keyframes, into Maya, set up the render globals to remaster specs, and allowed artists to quickly reference in remastered models over the original and set them up for the render farm. The full remastering and re-rendering of 3D files were only part of the process. We were unable to find about 1/3 of the 3D source assets, so we resorted to rotoscoping in Maya using the original cutscene frames as reference. After that, we still had to composite the 2D assets with the rendered 3D assets into cinematics and in-game cutscenes. Masking and match moving, as well as the logistics of tracking and timing file dependencies, was extremely time-consuming. Once again, a hope or an assumption of production gains is negated by new production overhead. Thus, in estimating our production for a remaster, consider that even if the core game mechanics and design remain the same, the production aspects are always a new undertaking and will pose as many challenges as the original title. The original core art production team on Full Throttle apparently comprised of 2 painters, 5 animators, 3 3D modelers, and an additional 4 animators and 5 artists in support, working over a 20 to 24-month period. By comparison, Full Throttle Remastered involved approximately 14 painters, about a dozen 2D animators, 3 3D animators, and 3 modelers ramping in and out over roughly 12 months. There were over 15,000 unique hand-animated frames, nearly 200 remastered backgrounds, and 445 individual FMV cuts that made up 134 FMVs. My special thanks to Double Fine, the Double Fine artists, and our production partners at Yada, Super Genius, and Lakshya. I'll close with a few general thoughts. I'm of the opinion that game development, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Production overhead and expectations always rush in to fill that vacuum. Or another way to look at it is that the game is never done, it's just taken away. Unless it's a mobile game, then it's just never done. Thank you.
So that's it for us, but if you guys have any questions, we'd love to answer them. So we'll open it up to you guys.
Do these mics work? Oh yeah, they do.
Everybody's mics work. Your mics work. I think there's one here. There's one there. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm Jeff from Clay. So for the StarCraft not redoing the cinematics, was that just a production issue, or was that because they wanted the core cinematics to stay the same?
It was a little bit of both. Initially, when we reached out, I think because of the people that we talked to were mostly professionals, the people that are continuously playing, they're not playing the single-player campaigns, and so it wasn't important to them. And so we kind of, like, that was the feedback we got. We're like, well, they're not really important. Nobody watches them anyway. So initially that was kind of our thing, but then once we started getting into it and we started showing what we've done with the multiplayer, they're like, "Are you guys redoing the cinematics?" And I was like, "Yes, let's do that." And but by that time we were kind of 6 months in, and it was just we would have to have somebody come in and actually rewrite everything. We'd have to go through lore. There's a lot of roadblocks on it, and eventually we just said it's just too much for our time that we wanted to do it.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay.
I guess this kind of applies to all three, but that's very loud. What was QA like? Did you guys have like aesthetic nostalgia QA for like checking in whether or not you were hitting home and the original characters feels, or just the environments feels, everything like that?
Speaking at least to our project, QA was absolutely headed up by an enormous fan. So key QA people on the project were people who were very big fans of the franchise, and the expectation was to be checking it against the original game and being mindful of things like that. Absolutely.
Cool.
So for us, we actually had an embedded QA team. Nobody from back when. But one of the things we had incorporated was an F5 key for testing so that we could switch back and forth, because to us it was really important that nothing really jumps out as different. And so like one of the main things we tested was like, you know what, while you're playing, push F5, play it in standard definition, go back to HD. If something pops out, then it's wrong and we had to redo it. And Like one of the, and this isn't even with gameplay, but one of the things we had is we had a Protoss portrait, and his eyes were supposed to be blue, and I think we changed them to red because in StarCraft 2 his eyes were red. And immediately, like in a focus group, I was like, how do you even know what the Protoss eyes colors is? But they're like, hey, it's supposed to be blue. And so we actually re-rendered it all and put that in there because it's one of those things. If somebody notices it, then we did it wrong. So
Yeah.
that was the main focus, was not to do anything that people noticed.
Gotcha.
Could you make the most subtle art in the world,
Yeah.
but also make it impactful?
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, more of a question for Crash. There was a lot of speedruns on the original game,
Yes.
and that means the speedrunners were using a lot of glitches or exploit. Has there been analysis to reproduce them in the remaster, or?
You're asking, was there intention to reproduce them, or were they reproduced?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if a speedrunner get on the remaster and try the exploit to get the same speedruns, has there been an analysis on reproduction?
So I can't speak too much to stuff like that because it hews more on the design end of the spectrum. But I do know that we had players who were doing like internal speed runs and time trials and testing things like that. I can't say whether we kept bugs in or intentionally removed them. Okay. We kind of did a mixture of polishing features and keeping features. So sorry I can't give you a really clean answer, but hopefully that's a little bit.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hey guys, this is for Cory. First of all, when I played it, I felt like I was 8 years old again. So you definitely.
All right.
I was actually just curious. How did you guys render the fur on all the characters?
Sure. Yeah. So it was a kind of a procedural shell solution that was made in house. Originally, it was part of my deck, but for time, we can't cover like everything. So the fur used kind of detail maps to kind of push out shells, like almost like traditionally, like from the mesh, and we'd use varying height maps to kind of get different amounts of kind of like variation in the height along the fur. We could scale the grain, we could push the height. Basically, we had a suite of sliders. We also had a normal brushing solution for doing the directionality of the fur. So we would create additional vertex normals and brush those, and that would give us our direction on top of the shells that were just being pushed out from the fur. We had an anisotropic feature on it as well, and the direction of the NISO would go with the brush to direction of the normals too. Yeah, it was, maybe at some point somebody will show that too.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, I'm Lizzie from Pixelix and GameSmart, and I was just wondering if you guys anticipate remastering any of your games in the future again.
Is that for everybody?
Everyone, yeah.
Yep.
So as the classic games team, we're basically taking each game as a case-by-case basis. Obviously, StarCraft is one because it's such an old game and it had never been incorporated into BattleNet, and we saw it as an opportunity to do that. But in general, the classic games team is just supporting all of our older games. If we're going to remaster any, that's kind of like up in the future, like does it require it, do people still play it? In general, we just want to make sure that all of our games are playable and the best experience that people can get. But not every game necessarily needs a remaster.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think from like Activision's perspective, just seeing the reception that Crash has received, opens doors to considering more projects like that. I can't say specifically whether like any are happening or what the future might be, but definitely when these projects like go over well, it makes people pay more attention.
Sure. And a lot of you had mentioned that you lost assets over time. Are you guys taking more precaution into saving them for whatever? So
That's another thing that we're kind of tasked with, especially across Blizzard, because now we have so many projects, is getting that resources. We actually set up a vault that will incorporate all of the work that we've done into like this one central location so that it's not lost again. StarCraft, I think, is one of the games that we've lost almost everything on. But, you know, we're still working through all of the old assets.
Yeah. Activision, the same thing. These days, we archive everything at the end of every project, but I think all three of us basically encountered the issue that nobody had the original stuff. We didn't have access to at least most of it. For the most part, anything that we looked at was extracted from the release builds of the game. But now we're much more diligent about source control. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
We'd love to chat.
All right.
All right, thank
if
you.
you guys want to do any personal questions, you don't want to talk, and we can. There's a room across the way for over there.
Outside of here.
Outside
if you feel
the
like
room.
just talking.
So if you want to come up and ask some questions, we'll just head over there and you can talk to us. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you guys very much.